Okay, I'm Cindy Kelly at Atomic Heritage Foundation. It is Friday, April 11, 2014, and I have with me Bill, or William Lanouette, who's going to talk about Leo Szilard. Why don't you start by actually saying your full name and spelling it?
I'm William Lanouette, Lanouette.
All right. Well, tell us about Szilard. Who was he? What's his background?
Leo Szilard was born Leo Spitz, S-P-I-T-Z, on February 11th, 1898, in Budapest, Hungary, to an assimilated Jewish family, middle class, in the Garden District of Budapest. In the year 1900, the family changed its name under the Magyarization, make things more Hungarian, to Szilard, S-Z-I-L-A-R-D, which means, I think, strong or stout or something like that. But the FBI, which kept an eye on Szilard, always referred to him as Leo Spitz because that was the first name that they had. He was born to a family that had eventually two other kids. He had a younger sister and brother. And he grew up in a household that was, more, I think, more like a colony than a household. It was three generations, all living in a huge villa, which one of his uncles had designed. So he had cousins and he had grandparents, and they could run around this marvelous Art Nouveau villa, and so he was very well socialized at an early age. But Szilard was also educated at home until high school through tutors. And so I think that's what gave him his independence of thinking and the freedom to just put things together in his own sweet way.
Fascinating. In your book you talk about he had an intense and exuberant childhood that enabled him to become a pioneer in science and politics.
His father was an engineer, so there was a technical side to the discussions, and he was very practical with his brother Bela, designing and building different things. They built a radio telegraph to communicate between rooms. They made some batteries. They wired up an old urn to try to make it into a tea kettle or samovar. So they had a practical bent, and both of them studied engineering. Only later did Leo switch to physics. And they loved just tinkering and playing around. He had cousins to play with in the backyard, and he usually ended up being the bossy one who supervised them because he was thinking of the implications. They were digging a hole at one point in the backyard, and he started worrying, well, if they did get to China, would they fall out the other side?
Sometimes people talk about Szilard as one of the Martians. Who came up with that term, and what does he mean?
That term came up during the Manhattan Project. There were four Hungarians, John von Neumann, Eugene Wegner, Edward Teller, and Leo Szilard, who picked up that nickname because of a story that came from a session with Fermi. Fermi was describing in one of their Chicago brainstorming sessions, well, if there are so many millions and millions of galaxies and planets, there must certainly be some planet somewhere that's much like ours and that would support life. And over the years there must have been some life, and there must have been some intelligent life. We can't be the only planet that developed such things, and they must have already explored, and they may already be here, but where are they? And at the seminar, Szilard said, well, they're here, but they're called Hungarians. And the epithet, or the nickname, the Martians, grew from that. It was also suspected that they were Martians because they were superhumanly intelligent and spoke an unearthly language.
about, can you talk about Szilard's education and the anti-Jewish decrees in Germany under Hitler in the 20s and 30s?
Under Horthy, you mean Horthy in the 20s, Hitler in the 30s? Yeah, sure. Szilard began attending a technical high school in Budapest when after 8 years of tutoring at home. It was called a real school because they taught math and science and other practical things. Just down the street from Szilard's residence was the Lutheran Gymnasium, where they taught a more classical education. And it was in that place that both Eugene Wigner and John von Neumann studied. Edward Teller studied in a school called the Minta, which was an experimental school elsewhere in Budapest. So it's not true that the four Martians all went to the same high school. Szilard excelled in science and in math, and he was very bright. And then he started to study engineering at the Technical Institute. I think it's now called the Technical University in Budapest. And then World War II began, and he was conscripted into the army and served in an artillery unit. There's a picture of his unit standing in front of a caisson, and Leo is leaning against the wheel, looking totally uninterested in what happened. He contracted Spanish flu just before the end of the war, and that brought him back to Budapest at a time when the rest of his unit was still fighting on the Italian front and was totally wiped out. So if it hadn't been for Spanish flu, there would be no Leo Szilard and his legacy. He returned to Budapest at the end of the war in November of 1918, and he went back to the Technical University to study. But in the spring of 1919, Béla Kun established a communist republic, and at that point, some of his studies were interrupted, but he kept at it. He and Béla founded the Hungarian Socialist Student Association to be a mediator between the royalists and the communists. And they handed out leaflets and they tried to organize discussions. But the Béla Kun government eventually fell, and a fascist Nicholas Horthy took over, and at that point he imposed a restriction that no Jews could study in the universities. So both Béla and Leo were denied education. They changed their affiliation to be Calvinists. That didn't help. The secret police were then following them because they had been associated with this socialist institution. They were on a short list for student activists who were supposed to be rounded up. And when Szilard tried to leave Hungary to study in Berlin, they wouldn't give him a visa. So it was only towards the end of the year, 1919, that his father bribed somebody to get him an exit visa. But even then, he was afraid of what the secret police were doing. And so he had Béla's help, and instead of going to Berlin via train, where he thought the secret police agents would be watching, he dragged his trunk full of books and other things down to the Danube and caught an excursion steamer, as any tourist might do. And that's how he got out of the country, and then didn't return for about 3 years because of his fear of Horthy's secret police. He then ended up went to Vienna, and then from there he went to Berlin, arriving in January 1920. Szilard, when he landed in Berlin, began studies of engineering at the Technische Hochschule. And after a few months, he was clearly becoming bored. It wasn't really what he wanted. He heard about the revolution in quantum physics, which was personified by a number of Nobel laureates at the University of Berlin. This included Albert Einstein and Max Planck and Francis Simon and Walter Nernst and Max von Laue, among other people. So Szilard started attending a seminar. There was a weekly colloquium of all these people who sat in the front row of this big auditorium. And he started attending this and found it much more fascinating than his engineering work. At the Technische Hochschule, a couple of months after Szilard arrived, his brother Bela, who's 2 years younger than him, arrived, and the two of them pretty well roomed together for the next several years at rooming houses where there was a landlady and who prepared their meals, or at places where they just rented a room and either ate out or cooked their own basic meals. Bela continued to study engineering and became an electrical engineer, and later in his career made many inventions in that field, and retired to Pleasantville, New York. He had been living in Manhattan, and when I began work on the book, I very luckily, through Bela's son, discovered that he was around, and he was very eager to help me and did a wonderful job, which is why the book is said to be with Bela Szilard. In Berlin, at the university, it was then customary for a student to meet with the professor and have him sign a record book and agree to have him in the course. So Szilard called on Max Planck, who was the father of quantum theory and physics, and wanted to take his course. And he was then a 22-year-old kid talking to a Nobel laureate, and he said to Professor Planck, he said, "I want to learn the facts of physics. I'll make up the theories myself." But Planck let him into the course, and pretty soon Szilard was, I would say, confident enough to start moving down the rows of this colloquium, and pretty soon he was sitting in the front row with some of these other people. There he struck up a friendship with Albert Einstein, and they lived in the same neighborhood in Berlin, in Charlottenburg, and so he took to walking Einstein home after the seminars. They became very good friends. They were both lateral thinkers who loved to just sit and brainstorm and kibitz and talk about religion, and in some correspondence were sharing ideas about Spinoza. They both had Jewish backgrounds, and Spinoza was a brilliant and legendary philosopher who had synthesized Jewish and scientific thought. So they would talk about all sorts of different things. And but Szilard was also comfortable enough to tell Einstein he was wrong about certain things, even in the middle of a lecture. But he once said, "That makes no sense," or "That's wrong," and Einstein would rather modestly agree. When they were together, they at the colloquium or in their walks, they grew to like and trust each other. So in the fall of 1920, when Szilard had transferred to the University of Berlin and had Max von Laue as his thesis advisor, he was assigned a problem. Von Laue was then the main interpreter of relativity theory, and he assigned Szilard a project. And Szilard worked on it, and he just couldn't seem to get it, and found something wrong. And so instead of pursuing von Laue's question, he started thinking in another way and about another thing that might work. And one thing that had puzzled people was called Maxwell's demon, after James Clerk Maxwell, who posed a particular problem in thermodynamics. And von Laue had also taught thermodynamics, but he hadn't approved of Szilard doing anything in this field. Szilard thought up something that actually became the basis for information theory by applying the concept of entropy to information in a thermodynamic equation. But he was afraid to go to von Laue and tell him he had not finished his project. So instead he went to Einstein. He said, would you look this over and see if this is okay? And Einstein looked at it and he said, well, that's impossible. And then he looked and he studied, and after 5 minutes Einstein said, yes, that's right. So with the confidence of Einstein behind his back, he went to von Laue and he presented this paper, and the next day von Laue said it was accepted as his thesis. So Szilard was quite cocky and freewheeling in his thinking. At one point he asked Einstein if he would teach statistical mechanics to a few friends from Budapest. Well, the friends included Eugene Wigner, who was later a Nobel laureate, John von Neumann, who was the developer of game theory and early computing, Dennis Gabor, who won the Nobel Prize for holography, and Leo Szilard. And the four of them would sit around with Einstein and would learn statistical mechanics. It must have been quite a session with all those people of those brains in the same room. And but Szilard would have the freedom to do this sort of thing, and he did it freely and often. Szilard had a rather unusual career. He didn't want to be a professor. In fact, after he did his doctoral thesis in physics, he said he wanted to do a second doctoral thesis in economics. He was very politically astute, and he loved reading the papers, and at that point Germany was undergoing excessive inflation, and he thought, well, maybe it would be possible to figure out something if I were an economist. The university told him, well, you can't really do another degree. When we give you a PhD, we certify that you are qualified and proficient in knowledge or science, and another degree is something that we don't do. But he didn't want to be a professor. He became instead a privatdozent, which is like a tutor, or what we might call today a teaching assistant. And he was a privatdozent under Max von Laue, and gave talks and lectures. He also teamed up to do some seminars with John von Neumann on new developments in physics, and on Erwin Schrödinger, also talking at the time about physics. He was about to teach a course with Lise Meitner early in 1933. Meitner later went on to be the person who recognized that nuclear fission, the splitting of the heavy uranium atom, was a phenomenon which became crucial to all atomic research after that. And I often wonder what would have happened if Szilard and Meitner had taught that course and had brainstormed the way he had brainstormed with Schrödinger and with John von Neumann. But instead, Szilard was banging around Berlin. He liked to travel. He liked to hike in the Alps. He frequently went to London in the late 1920s. From the time Szilard was 10 years old, he thought that it was his responsibility to save the world. He said at a too early age he read The Tragedy of Man, which is an epic a poem by Imre Madacs, the well-known Hungarian poet. And in this, they have Michelangelo and an archangel and philosophers and a trollop and a circus performer and all sorts of people interacting in pretty amazing ways of essentially assessing the human condition. But in the end of this epic poem, the earth is cooling and life is being destroyed, and only the Eskimos, who are already prepared for such, are able to survive the very cold weather. But then they start running out of food, and they too start to perish. But the message of the tragedy of man is that there was a hope, even among the Eskimos, and that the narrow margin of hope was something that Szilard picked up on at the very early age of 10 for solving any unsolvable problem. And it gave him an optimism and a sense of hope that really informed his whole life. So in the mid-1920s, when the German economy was really in the trash bin and when inflation was rampant, Szilard tried to think of a way to save the Weimar Republic. And he did it with an idea called the Bund, where you get the best and the brightest from several countries and you educate them, and they in turn inform one another, and then they move on in some unexplained way to give advice to the governments that need help about how to solve the world's problems. This idea took him several times to London, where he tried to meet with scientists, and he actually met H.G. Wells there, which got him thinking for the first time about atomic energy and atomic bombs. So in the spring of 1933, when Hitler took power and the Reichstag building was burned, the Capitol was burned, he packed 2 bags at the faculty club, and he said as soon as things get too bad, he was going to leave. And so at the end of March in 1933, he said things are getting too bad, and he caught the night train to Vienna. The next day, the next night, that same train was stopped. Non-Aryans were frisked and sent back, and their possessions were stolen. This led Szilard to say that in this world, to get ahead, you don't have to be much cleverer than other people, you just have to be one day earlier. He landed in Vienna, and there he met, through some economists he had known in Berlin, he met William Beveridge, who was the director of the London School of Economics. And Beveridge was in Vienna for a conference, and Szilard was then worried about other refugees and how they could be settled. Beveridge and a couple of other economists were thinking about this, and he met with them. And so Beveridge said, well, why don't you come to London and then you can help me. He was pretty soon on a train to London and landed in a big hotel in Russell Square, not far from the London School of Economics, and walked down Southampton Row frequently to bend Beveridge's ear about how we can solve the problem of the refugee scholars coming from Nazi Germany. What he did was he called on Harold Lasky, who was a famous political scientist and also a leader in the Labour Party. And together with just prodding these people and coming up with ideas and racing around Europe to Belgium to France to Switzerland to try to find out who could settle these refugees, he helped to found the Academic Assistance Council, which is now CARA, the Council for the Assistance of Refugee Academics, and which to this day thrives and helps people who are displaced by hostile governments. He worked on that refugee settlement, but he also wanted to become a biologist. He had met Max Delbruck in Berlin, who was a physicist who started to study biology before he left Germany. And it put in Szilard's mind the idea that biology might be the next theoretical field after physics. As far as he was concerned, physics, there wasn't much more to know about physics. He had pretty well solved the concept of information theory. His mind was moving in other directions. So when, in the summer of 1933 in London, across from his hotel was the University of London, he called on A.V. Hill, who was also a physicist turned biologist, who had won, or would win the Nobel Prize in biology. And he said, I'd like to learn biology. And Hill said, well, if you become a demonstrator in physiology, you can learn day by day what you're supposed to know, and then that way you'll start to learn biology. And so Szilard, in the September of 1933, was all set to start to be a demonstrator in physiology at the University of London, and then an idea hit him that changed his life and really changed the world. Lord Rutherford, who had a Nobel Prize and was running the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, had given a speech early in September in which he said, almost as an aside, that anyone who thinks you can get useful energy from the atom is talking moonshine. And Szilard didn't know what moonshine was, but he did know, as he said, that an expert is someone who tells you what can't be done. And he said it really annoyed him that Rutherford would say something like this, because how do you know what someone could think up? And this he pondered. And this is where science and science fiction come together, because at one of his earlier meetings with H.G. Wells, they talked about the need for atomic energy as a power source if humans were to explore other planets or other galaxies. So he had in mind that atomic energy was something special. He also read a book that Wells wrote in 1913 before the First World War called The World Set Free, in which in the 1950s there's a worldwide atomic war and all the major cities are destroyed. So Szilard had that image from science fiction that the atom was not only something that could liberate man for travel into space, it was also something that could destroy humanity. In 1932, the year before Szilard started thinking about things like Rutherford's challenge on moonshine, the neutron was discovered. And the neutron was discovered is a neutral subatomic particle. The proton is positively charged and the electron is negatively charged. But here was something new. The neutron, because it had no charge at all, could freely interact among other atoms. And so thinking about Rutherford's challenge on moonshine, he walked around the parks and the squares of the Bloomsbury neighborhood, and finally he said, after a week or two, he was standing at a traffic light in Southampton Row, which is probably right in front of his hotel on Russell Square. And as the light changed, it came to him how a neutron could enter the nucleus or core of an atom and how it could make it unstable and release. I think personally, having lived in London a number of years, that the pattern of the traffic lights had something to do with this, because unlike American traffic lights where it's red and then green, and then it's green and then yellow and then red, the pattern in the traffic lights in England blended so that red and yellow were on at the same time, and then yellow and green, as if these colors were blending with one another and not just ticking off. That's my own conjecture as to why he saw that pattern. But what he thought up were two essential concepts, the chain reaction and the critical mass. In the chain reaction that he thought about, a neutron with no charge would be fired to enter the nucleus of an atom, and he didn't know which one, and then it would make it unstable, and then if two neutrons were released, and they met other atoms, 2, 4, 8, 16, exponentially, eventually, all this energy would be released. And he also thought, well, you need a critical mass in order to make sure that there are enough atoms around to absorb these flying neutrons, or else they'll just go off into space. So you had to assemble some element in enough of a compact area so that once the chain started, it would be sustained. And at that point, his first reaction was, H.G. Wells, here we come. And he was thinking then of both atomic energy and of atomic weapons. So he was trying to figure out then in the fall of 1933 what element might in fact sustain a chain reaction. And the following spring, he patented the chain reaction, and he mentioned indium and beryllium and uranium as possible elements to sustain his nuclear chain reaction. He then went to the head of General Electric in the UK and said, I have a power source that will make coal and oil obsolete. He said, oh, thank you, doctor. And then he went to the Army and he said, I have a weapon that will make warfare obsolete. And the Army said, oh, thank you very much, doctor. But in a couple of years, he had made acquaintance with F.A. Lindemann, a physicist at Oxford. And F.A. Lindemann, when he heard this, agreed almost as a courtesy to make the chain reaction patent a military secret. But he did that in the Admiralty, not in the Army. And so starting about 1936, Szilard's chain reaction patent became a military secret. Szilard was fearful from the beginning that if he, with little training, could think up this, then certainly the German scientists who were behind him could be on the same track to nuclear weapons. Can I take a break now and get a little sip of water?
Great.
Yeah. Is this okay?
Oh, this is wonderful.
Good, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Are there any other details of the story so far that you want me to elaborate on that you could tuck in?
I don't think so. One nice thing is that you've got, for the curious student, I mean, this could be little excerpts for somebody's classroom, and it's wonderful. And then you've got the book.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
This is really nice.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's see. After Szilard patented the chain reaction, he then tried to find which element might sustain it. He was a refugee, he had some savings, he had no job, and so he poked around and he went to St. Bartholomew's Hospital where they were using some radioactive materials for medical purposes. And he teamed up with a fellow named Chalmers, and together in the course of their research, he didn't actually bombard any elements to find out what would happen, but he did inadvertently create the Szilard-Chalmers effect, which is a chemical way of separating isotopes. And he published this and is well recognized as being one of the early methods of isotope separation. I learned through my research that Maurice Goldhaber, who was also a German refugee ending up in England, he ended up in Cambridge, knew Szilard in the 1930s and knew about his work. And Goldhaber later became the director of the Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York State. And during their interactions in the 30s, Goldhaber said he had nominated Szilard for the Nobel Prize for the Szilard-Chalmers effect. At the time, it was really the only easy way to separate isotopes, and it was something that really impressed Goldhaber. So Szilard then he came to New York a couple of times. He went to NYU and tried to talk to the physicists there. He also applied early for immigration, and he went back and forth. He found a part-time position at Oxford under his friend Lindemann, and he walked around with little samples and was trying to get a neutron source and then tried to find which element would work. He wanted to get, I think it was 2,000 pounds, which was an awful lot of money, to test systematically each element in the periodic table, to bombard it with neutrons and see what would happen. At the same time, Enrico Fermi in Rome was bombarding uranium with neutrons, and he didn't realize he was getting nuclear fission. He was getting what he called transuranic elements, and these elements would absorb a neutron and become transuranic, or heavier than uranium, and they were other things, some of them very short-lived, lasting only a few seconds, others lasting much longer. A transuranic element later in the careers of Szilard and Fermi that became very important was plutonium, which is spun from a heavier form of uranium. The Szilard met Fermi in 1934 at a conference in London and warned him about the potential of transuranic elements, and Fermi didn't seem to think much of it. So in 35 and 36 he wrote to Fermi and he said, the two of us are working in an area which is potentially very dangerous if it becomes a military application. And he urged that Fermi and the other scientists in Rome and anyone else outside Germany not publish the results of their research, because he knew that the chain reaction was something that might in fact have military application. So Fermi didn't like that idea at all. It was just anti-scientific not to publish what you did. And Fermi had little interest in creating some corporation, which Szilard also wanted to do, to raise money to do this research, but to do it in secret. So Szilard was always an outlier in the sense that he saw years ahead of everybody else the need to do certain things, and with a political aspect also, as well as a scientific aspect. It was the way that Szilard combined science and politics, along with his incredible foresight, I think, that made him a special pioneer in the field, but also a bit of an outsider, because nobody really understood the implications that he saw and feared. If I may, I want to read a quote from Hans Bethe about this business of Szilard, because I think it's very telling. Let's see, it's in the old intro, not the new intro. So, preface, here we go. Hans Bethe knew Leo Szilard in London in 1933 and in 1934, and he admired Szilard for racing around from one country to another, up to Cambridge, out to different places to raise money for the academic refugees. And he joked later that they thought that Szilard was like a new modern particle that could be in two places at the same time. And then actually when Szilard's ashes were interred in 1998, the centennial of his birth, half the ashes went to Kerepesi Cemetery in Budapest, and half the ashes went to Lakeview Cemetery in Ithaca, New York, where Szilard's wife's family was buried. And Hans Bethe attended the interment in Ithaca, and he said, in the 1930s, we suspected that Szilard running around could be in two places at once, and now we know it's true. Hans Bethe was a great admirer of Leo Szilard. Hans Bethe is a physicist who won the Nobel Prize for explaining the carbon cycle and how the sun works. He said, Leo Szilard was a very complex personality. He was one of the most intelligent people I have ever known. His mind worked quickly and profoundly, and he was able to come to ideas that most of us appreciated only after many hours of talk. This was his strength and, of course, also his weakness. He was always ahead of his time. His ideas often were expressed in paradoxes, and the paradoxes were not always understood. I think this is probably the greatest detriment to Szilard, that he was so foresighted. And you may be able to trace it to that early education where he had governesses and he had tutors, and he could really just be freewheeling and put any ideas together at any time. It ultimately made him quite a misfit in the scientific community. It also prevented him from wanting a full-time academic job. And so this, I think, explains why Szilard was really a special individual in the whole scientific field. His sister-in-law, Frances Racker, once said, Leo wasn't a person, he was a phenomenon. And in a way, I think he spent most of his life trying to catch up with all the bright ideas that kept popping into his head. Let me think about Szilard worked at Oxford, but he kept in touch with scientists in London and in Cambridge, and he said that he was conducting something. He was almost afraid to describe what it was because of the potential. But he said he wanted to get different samples, and he wanted to get a neutron source, and he wanted to mess around, and nobody really understood what he was about. He didn't have a laboratory of his own, so he met with his friend Maurice Goldhaber in London, and he said, well, I've been over to NYU a couple of times, and I'm doing some research. And Goldhaber admired him for the Szilard-Chalmers effect, but didn't really know what was going on at the moment. And Leo said, well, I'm going to go to the United States a year before the war. And he could see the war coming. And so in 1938, Szilard sailed for New York and landed in New York City, where he had some contacts at New York University, but where he ultimately settled as a guest scholar at Columbia University. He chased around throughout most of 1938. He went to Rochester, he went to Illinois, University of Illinois. He was, again, trying to find some element and find some lab that would run these different experiments. And he never could do it. He never really put it all together. And so in December of 1938, he sat down, finally frustrated, and he wrote a letter to the Admiralty, and he said, the idea of a nuclear chain reaction won't work, and there's no need to keep this patent secret, and indeed there's no need to keep this patent. It won't work. Well, the very same day in Berlin, Hahn and Strassmann split the uranium atom, and it was soon discovered that this was the element Szilard was looking for. When Niels Bohr, who had heard about nuclear fission through Lisa Meitner, arrived in January in New York City, and the word spread that uranium had been split or fissioned, Szilard was shocked and scared. And he shot off a telegram to the Admiralty saying, ignore my previous letter, keep the chain reaction secret. At that point, he was really then, he thought, in a race with time. The the people he feared had split the uranium atom. Surely they're going to see what's happening. And he then tried to enlist Eugene Wigner, who was at Princeton, and other scientists to conduct research. He worked with Walter Zinn, and he worked with Enrico Fermi at Columbia, and he also worked with Herbert Anderson, who was a colleague of Enrico Fermi, and together they started testing, well, is an extra neutron released? And if it is, then there is this potential for the chain reaction to develop energy and perhaps also lead to an explosion. And by the spring of 1939, they discovered, indeed, an extra neutron was coming out of any bombardment of uranium. Szilard and Zinn ran an experiment that he later described where they had something like a TV screen to track the path of the subatomic elements. And so they started to work with the bombardment from their radiation source, and nothing. They saw nothing. Szilard said he was relieved. The chain reaction doesn't work after all, and I don't have to worry about a bomb. And then Zinn discovered they hadn't turned on the screen, and so they turned on the screen, and they discovered, in fact, that extra neutrons were released. And he called his friend Edward Teller, who was then at George Washington University, and he said, we found the extra neutrons. And from then on, he was really racing to keep all the research in the United States secret. And he went to Fermi, who hated this idea that you don't publish what you're actually finding. But he finally persuaded Fermi not to publish the research that he and Zinn and Anderson were doing at Columbia University. And then with this knowledge in mind, he started to think, how could you design a reactor that would in fact sustain the chain reaction and produce heat, which is something that they were interested in. And they thought if you produce heat, you might be able to power a ship. And so he sent Fermi down to the Navy to describe the fact that there is now this potential for atomic energy, and it might in fact be useful in ships, especially submarines, because it wouldn't need oxygen. And you wouldn't have to have a snorkel to run a diesel engine. You could have an atomic engine in your ships. And the Navy just missed the point entirely. They ridiculed him for his accent, and they said, well, thank you very much. So Fermi went back to Columbia and reported there's just no interest in this at all, which only drove Szilard to be madder and more determined to find ways to understand the nuclear chain reaction. That summer, Fermi went off to Ann Arbor to study cosmic rays. When they discussed things, Fermi said, the chain reaction might be useful in 25 or 50 years, and Szilard was afraid that it was something that could be useful right away. So he hounded Fermi with a series of airmail letters back and forth in July of 1939, and Fermi responded with a particular design, and Szilard said, no, you need another design. And eventually, over exchange of 5 or 6 letters, the two of them co-designed the world's first nuclear reactor. And it involved, Fermi first thought you need layers of uranium surrounded by graphite, which was going to slow down or moderate the reaction. And Szilard said, no, that wouldn't work. What you had to do was have spheres of uranium embedded in a three-dimensional lattice array. And Fermi reluctantly agreed, and they drew up plans, and that became the first nuclear reactor design. Well, having this now certified, Szilard was really scared of what would happen with a nuclear chain reaction in the wrong hands. And so he went out to Long Island to track down his old friend Albert Einstein, who was staying in a cottage there and sailing and generally relaxing. Szilard never drove a car, so his chauffeur, the first time he visited Einstein, was Eugene Wigner. And they went out and they explained to Einstein that there is this incredible concept which we've tested, which is a nuclear chain reaction. It's E equals mc squared, realized. Energy is produced from mass. And Einstein's first reaction, I haven't thought of that at all. And of course he hadn't. He was working for his unified field theory, and he was very much more theoretical. But Einstein was surprised and then even shocked by the explanation, and soon realized that this is something that would really change the world. It was also Einstein's reaction, Szilard remembered, that he thought, you know, this is the only power source that I can think of that doesn't depend on the sun. Now you have, of course, solar energy, which we know today, but also through photosynthesis, all of the fossil fuels depend on the power of the sun being trapped in these plants. And so Einstein realized just how special the nuclear chain reaction and the release of the energy in an atom would be. And then they were quite concerned. They said, well, we have to warn the Belgians because they control the largest stock of uranium in the world. And Einstein had known the royal family from Belgium. They had put him up when he left Germany. He used to call them the Kings as a nickname. And so they started to draft a letter to the Belgian royal family, to the King of Belgium, warning him about the strategic importance of all the uranium in the Belgian Congo. And then they messed around with some drafts, and they realized it's more important than this. We really should warn the U.S. government. First they thought of warning the State Department, and finally they said, no, we need to warn the president. So they drafted a second set of letters in drafts to the President of the United States, warning him about nuclear chain reactions and their military potential. And when the draft was finished, it was Edward Teller, his other Hungarian friend, who was the chauffeur to take him out to meet Einstein. And Edward Teller is reported to have said, I entered the nuclear age as Leo Szilard's chauffeur. Once Szilard and Einstein had agreed on a draft, it was Szilard's task to arrange for the letter to be typed up. So he called in Janet Coatsworth, who worked and lived near Columbia University. He invited Coatsworth to his room at the King's Crown Hotel, and the place was, she remembered, was littered with papers, and he was rushing around and trying to dictate this letter. So he says, take a letter to the President of the United States. And she looked at him, she didn't know what was going on. And then he said, there's this new and powerful bomb, which is something that might destroy a whole harbor and a whole city. And she wasn't sure. Now sign it, Albert Einstein. She knew he was nuts, but she did type it up, and then Szilard enlisted Edward Teller to drive him out to Long Island where they could review the letter. And Einstein signed that letter, and then Szilard was faced with the idea of how to get it to the president. He knew through an economist whose name was Stolper that there were some businessmen and investors who knew FDR, President Roosevelt, and who in fact had been advisors to the New Deal of FDR. And so he tried to enlist their help, and one person was Alexander Sachs, who had frequent visits to the White House and claimed that he could get this letter directly to the president. They weren't just going to put it in the mail. But then World War II began. The letter is dated August 2nd, and on September 1st, the World War II began when Germany invaded Poland. And so the White House and, of course, the president were distracted. And it wasn't until early October, or on Columbus Day, that Sachs finally got an appointment to meet with President Roosevelt. And he came in, and he had prepared his own big memo, and he had the letter, and he was starting to do this, and he was fumbling, and he didn't really make a very good impression, and he didn't really deliver the letter, and Roosevelt was either distracted or annoyed, and the meeting ended inconclusively. But Sachs asked if he could come back the next day, and the next day he actually did present and read the letter, and Roosevelt's reaction was, well, Alex, I guess you want to be sure that the Germans don't blow us up. And he said, that's right, that's what's going to happen. So he then said, he picked up the phone to his assistant, Pa Watson, and said, Pa, this deserves action. Well, unfortunately, the only action was to create a government committee. And at the Bureau of Standards, Lyman Briggs was head of the Bureau of Standards. He was asked to form a uranium committee. Now, at the time, and it must be remembered before the war, the government had very little to do with scientific research. The Navy did some applied work, and there was some medical research going on. But essentially, the Bureau of Standards was the most scientific center of the federal government at the time. So it was the logical place to put the Uranium Committee, but in fact they had few resources and really few interests in this kind of project. So the first meeting of the Uranium Committee was called, and Eugene Wigner and Edward Teller and Leo Szilard showed up, and they started telling the Army about this incredible thing. And one general, I'm sure, rolled his eyes and said, well, you know, out at Aberdeen we have a goat, and we have a goat stuck out in the field, and we're trying to get a death ray to kill the goat. Is this what you're talking about? Some kind of an X-ray or something like that? They just didn't get it. But they somehow, in their Hungarian German accents, made the point that this really deserves extra attention, that serious scientists here and in Germany are working on it. And so one of the generals said, well, how much money do you want? And I think it was Teller blurted out $6,000. So I will get you your $6,000. And they were on their way. But nothing happened. Fermi and Szilard were then building what they called exponential piles, where they were taking graphite and stacking it with a little uranium inside. You just see how the neutrons would move around, and how uranium might be absorbing neutrons, and whether in fact it was setting off extra neutrons. Now they use graphite as a moderator to slow down the neutrons, because if the neutrons were released at a regular speed, they would, I can't say bounce off, but they might be repelled, or they might miss, or they might go right through an atom. But if you had a slow or moderated neutron that slowed down, it gave it a better chance of going into that nucleus and making it unstable and splitting it. So the moderator was the secret. Today, nuclear power plants use water as the moderator to slow down the neutrons in order to chain react. At the time, they thought graphite was the best. But then Szilard realized that, well, something wasn't working quite right, and maybe there's something wrong with graphite. The Germans, by the way, were also trying graphite. And Szilard thought, well, maybe there are some impurities. And he and Fermi met with the U.S. Carbon Company people over lunch one day. And Szilard said, well, are there any impurities in graphite that you sell? And well, as a matter of fact, there are. We use a certain process that involves boron. And Szilard and Fermi saw right away, boron absorbs neutrons. So commercial graphite was too full of boron to allow the chain reaction to continue. Szilard then ran around to the suppliers and got 99% pure graphite, and he and Fermi used that, and it worked. So they knew that that was the key. The Germans did not figure this out. They used commercial graphite. It didn't work. So they said, we need another moderator, and they went to heavy water, which is made through electrochemistry, and the only source of the heavy water was in Norway at the time at a hydroelectric facility, which the Norwegians and then the Allies destroyed, and so the Germans never had a chance to really set off a chain reaction either with graphite or with heavy water. Hans Bethe said at the interment of Szilard's ashes that all they really needed for the Manhattan Project was the ideas of Leo Szilard. And if the Germans had Leo Szilard, they would have had a bomb a lot sooner. So Szilard was key to some of these essential steps, getting the government involved, discovering that you need pure graphite, and then eventually with designing and refining the design of the reactor. In 1940, they had met in the Uranium Committee in October of '39. In 1940, there was still no money coming from the Uranium Committee for Fermi and Szilard. Szilard by this time had drafted an explanation of how the chain reaction could work, and he sent it to the Physical Review, but said, don't publish it, just hold it. He wanted to be on record that this was the way a chain reaction would work. And he was getting more and more annoyed, and so he went back to Einstein and he said, we need another letter to really warn these people that they're sitting on something that's very important. And in effect, they blackmailed the government. They sent this was now the third letter. The first letter warned about the bomb. The second letter was acknowledgement of FDR's reply. The third letter said that Dr. Szilard is working on this particular project, and he has a paper he wants to publish, but he doesn't want to publish it. But he will publish it if the aid isn't forthcoming. And so this apparently registered somewhere within the White House because they then started running security clearances on Fermi and Szilard to see if they should be getting this money. They were both enemy aliens at that point. The war was on. Italy and Germany were both battling the United States. At this point, Szilard had a German passport. And so the Army drew up a report on Fermi and Szilard, and they said that Fermi, I'm paraphrasing here, but Fermi was undoubtedly a fascist, and he was distrustful of the government, and he should not be trusted with the secret work. And that Szilard was clearly sympathetic with the Germans, and that he should not be trusted with the secret work. Well, at the time, the only secret work was in the heads of Fermi and Szilard. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was then enlisted to try to find a way to give these scientists the money they had asked for. And so they sent FBI agents to Princeton to interview Albert Einstein. And Einstein, who had just become a citizen himself, said, yes, they're trustworthy and they're knowledgeable and they deserve the money. And so it was Einstein, although he wasn't directly involved, through all these things like a letter and an FBI interview, who actually kept the ball rolling. And the money finally came, and they were finally building their exponential piles, which are ways of discovering how particles work within a controlled, moderated structure. At Columbia, the graphite had to be stacked, and Fermi, who was quite practical, both as an experimental scientist and a theorist, was in there with the other people getting their hands dirty with stacking this graphite. Szilard refused to do this, and Fermi became quite annoyed with him over that. But eventually Dean Pegram, who was head of the physics department, enlisted the football team of Columbia University to stack the graphite, so the scientists didn't have to do it. Early in 1942, after then most of a year of their work at Columbia, Szilard was thinking, well, where should they build the first reactor? And he found a blimp hangar in New Jersey, and he found a polo club on Long Island, and he found a golf course in Yonkers. They were always thinking that they wanted to stay around Columbia. And so there were 4 or 5 sites that would have been the site for the first nuclear chain reaction and the first operating reactor, but for the further intervention of the U.S. government. Not only did they give the 6,000 to Fermi and Szilard, but they were also creating another structure, which eventually became the Manhattan Project when the Army took it over in June of 1942. So in the spring of 1942, the U.S. government was increasingly involved, and they were trying to decide where atomic research should be consolidated. They thought it might be in St. Louis. They weren't sure whether it might be in another city. They didn't want it to be on the coast because of fear of German attacks. And so when James Conant and Vannevar Bush were looking at the situation as the civilian advisors on this program, Arthur Compton at the University of Chicago made a bid that we should have the research focused there, and in February of 1942 the Fermi-Szilard work was moved to Chicago under the aegis of Compton, who was also a Nobel laureate in physics. And that's why the world's first nuclear chain reaction occurred on the campus of the University of Chicago and not at a blimp hangar in New Jersey or a golf course in Yonkers. As the work proceeded through the spring and summer of 1942 in Chicago, the design had been refined, and they were actually building and stacking the graphite for this reactor. They had initially planned to build the reactor out of town. There was some concern as to what would actually happen in a chain reaction. And so they had found a place out of town, which later on became the Argonne National Laboratory. But the trouble was there was a carpenter strike at this time, and so the carpenters weren't building anything out there, and they said, well, then we're going to have to do it somewhere else, and they found a vacant squash court under the abandoned stands of the football field. University of Chicago had given up football, and the west stands of Stagg Field were unused, so there was this squash court under the stands, and they decided that that's where they had to build the first reactor, and they did. There was some concern that the reaction might run wild, so they enlisted Hans Bethe to come out and give some second calculations as to what a chain reaction would do, given this amount of graphite and the calculations he studied, and he concluded and told them he was pretty sure that it wouldn't explode and it wouldn't run wild and release radiation in any way. So they pretty well then had the green light. But Szilard was still quite concerned. And so, as he said, the night before the first test, which was December 2nd, 1942, December 1st, 1942, that evening he went out and he had a second dinner. And he told the person who he ate with the second time that night, why was he having a second dinner? And Szilard, who was always a voracious eater, said, well, we have an experiment that we're going to run tomorrow. Chances are it won't work at all, but there's a remote chance it will work too well. And if it works too well, that's why I'm having a second dinner tonight. Well, it turned out it worked brilliantly. And afterwards, they cracked open a bottle of Chianti, which Wigner had arranged in Fermi's honor, and later on they all signed the basket around the Chianti bottle, and they were all really pretty pleased with themselves. And after the other scientists left the chamber, Szilard and Fermi found themselves standing together on the balcony that overlooked the squash court. And at that point, Szilard turned and shook Fermi's hand and congratulated him, and then announced, this day will go down as a black day in the history of mankind. Again, Szilard was seeing what was coming. In June of 1945, the Army was assigned what became the Manhattan Project, the research that was being conducted not only at Chicago, but increasingly at other sites. And in September of that year, General Leslie R. Groves took charge of the Manhattan Project. And he paid a call on the scientists in Chicago and had his first of many run-ins with Leo Szilard. Szilard found his whole presentation to be pompous and rather imperious. In turn, the questions that Szilard and others asked annoyed Groves, who later said, well, if somebody just threw a bomb through that window, we wouldn't have to worry about these scientists again. Szilard once said that his favorite hobby was baiting brass hats, by which he meant making fun of the military. He saw the military as being rigid and uninventive, and as far as he was concerned, much more restrictive than supportive throughout the whole Manhattan Project. The first encounter between General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, and Szilard was remembered by many, and I tried to capture the dynamics in the book Genius in the Shadows. So I will describe their first encounter. General Groves first visited the Met Lab on Monday, October 5th, where, as he wrote in his History of the Manhattan Project, he met Compton and his assistant Norman Hilberry, Fermi, James Franck, and the brilliant Hungarian physicists Eugene Wigner and Leo Szilard. After the meeting, Groves and Compton resumed a discussion we had begun earlier with Szilard on how to reduce the number of approaches which were being explored for cooling the pile. The pile was the nickname for the pile of graphite, which was in fact the reactor. Szilard had many ideas about reactor design, and it was at this time that he actually thought up and named the nuclear breeder reactor, which is supposed to make more fuel than it consumes by bombarding uranium-238, which does not fission, turning it into plutonium-239, which does fission. And as Alvin Weinberg, later the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory, remembered, Wigner and Weinberg and Szilard were walking across the quadrangle at the University of Chicago. What are we going to call this? And Szilard said, let's call it breeding, let's call it a breeder. So he not only thought it up and designed 3 breeders to make plutonium during the war, but he also named the breeder reactor. Szilard was just full of ideas throughout this process. 4 months using helium, air, water, and heavy water were under active study, Groves remembered. This is the only mention Groves made of Szilard in his book, perhaps because it recounted the only time when they were not in direct conflict with one another. The 2 men took a quick dislike to each other and personified the Manhattan Project's struggles between the scientist and the soldier. But it was more personal than that. Groves's authoritarian, anti-Semitic views cast Szilard as a pushy Jewish busybody. Szilard's openness and glee at baiting brass hats cast Groves as a rigid militarist who also seemed not too bright. Groves considered Szilard the only villain in the Manhattan Project, he later said, while Szilard considered Groves its biggest fool. The 2 of them really took to disliking one another. General, what would you think if someone threw a hand grenade through that window? His aide said after the meeting with the scientists. It'd be a damn good thing, Groves snapped. There's too much hot air in there. Now, Szilard at this point was still an enemy alien. He did not become a citizen until 1943. So in the fall of 1942, shortly after meeting for the first time with the Chicago scientists, Groves decided that Szilard was a real troublemaker, and he wanted to have him locked up for the duration of the war as an enemy alien. He went as far as the Secretary of War, to the office of the Secretary of War, to ask that Szilard be interred. The Secretary of War, with the advice of Compton, said, no, you can't do that. But thereafter, Szilard was under constant surveillance by the security people of the Manhattan Project, and Groves said, despite the barrenness of any results, you have to keep watching for Szilard in case he does something that we can catch him on. The 2 of them really disliked one another, as I say, for personal and for professional reasons. And when Szilard couldn't be interred, he still seemed to be a troublemaker to Groves. This came up again with the Szilard patent, which had to be assigned to the Army. And Groves wanted it to be signed over with no compensation. Szilard said, I want compensation, but only for the money I've spent since 1934 developing this reaction. And it includes supplies he had bought in England and in the United States, and money he had spent. He borrowed $2,000 for the Fermi Szilard work at Columbia, and Szilard came up with a rather small number of several $1,000s that he thought he should be compensated for before he signed over his reactor patent. Well, Groves would have none of this, so he assigned a lawyer, James Hume, who I had the good fortune of finding and interviewing, to represent Szilard in the negotiations with the Army. And Hume had to be given a security clearance, and he had to be educated in nuclear science, and he had several very testy meetings with Groves over how this whole patent should be assigned. At one of the meetings, the last one, Szilard recounted that it was like meeting somebody with a raincoat who had a bulge in his pocket, and you weren't sure whether it was his fist or a gun. And Groves was threatening to, he thought, to somehow punish Szilard if he didn't sign over the patent. During this dispute in 1943 into early 1944, Szilard was actually taken off the payroll of the Manhattan Project. He was still allowed to continue to work, and he volunteered his time, but it was a very testy situation, and finally Szilard, through the negotiations of James Hume, got the Army to agree to cover his expenses, at which point he signed over the chain reaction. And it was shortly thereafter that the patent for the Szilard-Fermi reactor, or the Fermi-Szilard reactor, however you want to call it, was applied for in secret. For several years it was referred to as a reactor designed by E. Fermi et al., the et al. Being Leo Szilard, which is one of many reasons that he's lost in the shadows of history. Does that explain that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, wow.
Beginning in 1944, Szilard became ambivalent about the bomb. They had no evidence at that point that the Germans were in fact building a bomb, and he was already concerned about the future, in this case a post-war nuclear arms race with Russia, which he was worried about in '44. And he thought the only solution should be international control, in which the Allies create a world control system, essentially first to control all the uranium, but then also to regulate the technology and to share it under some agreed method. He called on Vannevar Bush, he called on James Conant, and bent their ears about international control. We see in the record that a few days after Szilard had pressed the idea of international control on Bush and Conant, they in turn presented it to President Roosevelt. So Szilard's ideas were getting through, but he was somebody who still felt he was a bit of an outcast. Towards the end of 1944, Szilard was so concerned about international control that he thought the only way that you could have it was to shock the world, and that after all, you should use the bomb on cities so that it's so horrible that mankind will recognize this and will finally control it. But that thought lasted only a month or so, and he then realized how horrible it would be to level a city the way they thought they could. And so by the spring of 1945, he tried 3 ways to stop the bomb. He assumed that Germany was defeated, and he wanted to be sure that it was not used on Japan, because he thought that would trigger an international arms race with the Soviet Union. There's something awfully ironic about June of 1942. That was the month that the Fermi-Szilard work, the work by Compton at Columbia and other places, were finally consolidated under the command of the U.S. Army, where they then had a budget that they could conceal, and the project was in the United States scaled up until more than 130,000 people at sites all over the country were building the bomb. Well, in Berlin in June of 1942, something quite different happened. Werner Heisenberg and the people who had been working on the bomb since the spring of 1939 called on Albert Speer, the munitions minister, and said, it's not likely that we're going to have a workable weapon before we win the war. They thought in '42 that they were winning the war. Their lab in Berlin had been bombed once or twice. They were trying to find another source. They made this crucial mistake of using graphite and deciding it wouldn't work. They couldn't get the heavy water supplies that they need, nor did they at that point even have a lab, so they essentially threw in the towel. And they said there's no point in spending money on this, it's just not worth it. So the very month we ramped up, they ramped down. We didn't know that until several years later, but the fear that the Germans were still ahead of us, and for a while they had been, drove the Manhattan Project on and on and on. By the spring of '45, Szilard wanted to prevent the bombing of Japan, and if the weapon worked, he wanted to put it under international control. And he tried 3 ways. In March of 1945, he went to Princeton, he called on Einstein, and got a 4th letter from Einstein to Roosevelt. After the war, Einstein said his only role in this whole thing was as Leo Szilard's mailbox. He drafted a letter saying that FDR or the cabinet should meet with Dr. Szilard and talk about his ideas for what will happen after the war with their work. Einstein really didn't know much about the work. He knew it had military implications, and he trusted Szilard implicitly. The letter never reached Franklin Roosevelt before he died on April 12th of 1945. So in May, Szilard took the letter and a memo he had made describing international control schemes to the Truman White House. And they knew something about the previous contact, but not much. And so Truman, instead of meeting with Szilard, said, you should go to see James F. Burns in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Szilard didn't know who James Burns was, but the president told him to take a trip and visit Burns. So he enlisted for this trip to Spartanburg Harold Urey, who had won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for isotope separation. In fact, one of the processes we used to make the uranium for the Hiroshima bomb. By the spring of 1945, Urey was fed up with the secrecy. He too thought Germany was defeated, and he quit the Manhattan Project. So he wasn't even working on the project officially when he joined Leo Szilard for an overnight train ride from Washington to Spartanburg, South Carolina. There they met in his home James F. Burns. Burns is an interesting character. He bragged about being in all 3 branches of government. Burns had been a congressman from South Carolina. He had been a senator from South Carolina. Franklin Roosevelt made him a justice on the Supreme Court, and then took him off the Supreme Court to be what became assistant president working in the White House to run war mobilization plans. So he was called on the cover of Life magazine the assistant president. He was a well-known public figure. In 1944, at the Chicago Democratic National Convention, Burns was expected to replace Henry Wallace as Franklin Roosevelt's vice president. He was the leading candidate to become the next vice president. But Burns was a segregationist. He had anti-union attitudes, and the Northerners in the Democratic Party didn't like that. So instead they picked Harry Truman as a compromise, and Harry Truman, in November of 1944, became the Vice President of the United States. Burns had been Truman's mentor, had looked over him, and Truman had looked up to Burns. So after Truman took office, it was Burns who first briefed him about atomic weapons, and it was Burns who became Truman's representative on what was called the Interim Committee, which was deciding within the government how to use this new weapon. Well, Szilard didn't know that at the time, so he arrived in Spartanburg and he was greeted by Burns, and he has this memo about international control, which Burns had received already from the White House. He saw what was coming, but he thought it was naive and foolish to think that the Russians or even the British would cooperate with us, and he thought that was pretty silly. Besides, Burns had more in mind. He had attended with FDR the meeting in Yalta with Stalin, in which they were talking about post-war settlements in Eastern Europe. That was in February of 1945. In May of 1945, May 8th, the Germans surrendered. So on May 28th, when Urey and Szilard call on Burns, we learn later, Burns is really worried about what the Russians are doing in Eastern Europe. And he told them that we had to use this bomb for two reasons. We had spent $2 billion behind the backs of Congress, and if we didn't use it, there'd be all hell to pay and there would be endless hearings. Second, he wanted the bomb to make Russia more manageable in Eastern Europe. They were encroaching on the Eastern European countries. In Hungary, in Poland, they were affecting plans for elections, and Burns knew something that Szilard didn't know, that he was about to be named Secretary of State. So he had big worries about Stalin and post-war antagonisms between the former allies. The two argued, and they came to no conclusion at all. Burns thought they were naive. Szilard and Burns have both written about this in their memoirs. They both discussed it in a 1960 interview in U.S. News and World Report, and based on that I was able, in fact, to co-author a play about that meeting called Uranium Plus Peaches. When Szilard left for the train station, he said, "I've never been as depressed in my life." And what would have happened had he been born in the United States and become influential in American politics, and had Burns been born in Hungary and become a physicist. He said, in all likelihood, there would be no atom bomb and there would be no nuclear arms race with Russia. So his first attempt to stop the bomb had failed. He went back to Chicago, and there he worked with James Franck, who was a Nobel laureate, and Eugene Rabinowitz and other scientists to draft, at the request of the Secretary of War, a report that became known as the Franck Report, which argued about post-war controls and also urged a demonstration of the bomb before it was used on cities. The Franck Report went to the Secretary of War and had little effect on the way the decision to use the bomb actually occurred. In the third, then desperate attempt to stop the bomb, Szilard remembered, well, as an American citizen, I have the right to petition the president. And he drafted a petition to President Harry Truman, in which he didn't call for a demonstration, as the Franck Report had, but just for moral consideration for using this weapon before you use it on cities. In all, 155 Manhattan Project scientists signed it at Chicago and at Oak Ridge. Ralph Lapp took this petition to Los Alamos on one of his trips there, and a copy was given to Edward Teller and other people. And Teller went to Oppenheimer with the petition and said, Szilard has sent me this petition, can we circulate it? And Oppenheimer said, absolutely not. It's not our responsibility to be calling the shots in policy. And so he banned the petition circulation at Los Alamos. In the opera Dr. Atomic, it isn't quite that way. Edward Teller is waving a petition that he received from his friend Leo Szilard. The petition is passed around to all the scientists and they debate and they talk about it. But unfortunately, thanks to Oppenheimer, that never happened. The Army was suspicious. Szilard agreed the petition would go through the normal channels. He wouldn't send a letter or have Einstein forward it. It was going to go through the normal channels of the Army. And first in Chicago and then at Oak Ridge, which was the intermediary step to the Pentagon, they were suspicious of what was in this petition. So they commissioned a poll. And they said, well, how many of you scientists really think we should demonstrate the bomb? And to their chagrin, they found 83% said some kind of a demonstration out of the 5 options they were given should be used. But that advice was ignored. As we know, for lots of other reasons, the bomb had a life of its own. There was no real debated decision about the bomb It was made available and it was used. And afterwards, we've been debating ever since as to whether it should be used or not. But Szilard at that point then knew, he said, that they were about to test the bomb. This would have been in mid-July when his petition was being prepared. He said he knew that because the phone connections to Los Alamos had been cut off. So, of course, something was going on. And sure enough, on the 16th of July, the first bomb was tested in New Mexico. The first bomb was dropped, the Hiroshima bomb, on August 6th, and the second bomb was dropped on August 9th. And Szilard was asked later, well, what was your reaction when Hiroshima was bombed? And he said, I felt a great sense of relief. Why relief? Because now he could finally talk about the bomb in public. And he took the petition and he tried to have Science magazine publish the petition to show that scientists were on record as saying that this should not be used against a non-atomic enemy, as it had been planned to be used against an atomic enemy, Germany, and it should not be used as an offensive, but only as a defensive weapon. Well, General Groves heard about this, and he had already put some censorship controls in place, and he told the editors at Science magazine they could not publish the petition because it was secret. But it wasn't secret, so he stamped it secret. And it was not declassified until 1961, and it was not published until 1963, a year before Szilard died. After the war, Szilard said the most powerful weapon of the Manhattan Project was not the A-bomb, it was the secret stamp.
That's great.
Okay, so we get up to the, you want to talk about the founding of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists or anything else?
Yeah, sure. That'd be great.
Beginning in the fall of 1945, the scientists in Chicago formed a federation of atomic scientists. At Los Alamos, there was a federation of Los Alamos scientists. There was a similar group at Oak Ridge. They eventually became the Federation of American Scientists, which is today still a powerful group of scientists in the whole public debate about arms control and other public issues. In Chicago, a number of scientists said the public should be educated, and they founded the monthly magazine, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which continues today, not published but on websites, with a very informative and effective website about science and world affairs. During the war, General Groves tried to have Szilard locked up as an enemy alien. He failed. He next tried to get the Manhattan Project to have the chain reaction patent free of charge. Szilard extracted at least his expenses. After the war, Szilard privately sent to his assistant, Colonel Nichols, instructions that Szilard should be fired from the project and that his contract should not be renewed. In turn, though, Szilard got a sort of revenge. I'm not sure he meant it to be personal, but it certainly destroyed Groves. Right after the war, there was an idea that the control of the A-bomb should stay in the Army. And a May Johnson bill was proposed that would make the Army the custodian of atomic energy and atomic energy research. Szilard rallied Harold Urey and Oppenheimer and even Fermi and others to testify against this. They thought there should be civilian control of atomic energy. In fact, I think they wasted about a year over this particular issue. But here's why they wanted civilian control. At this point, they had shocked the world with 2 bombs. They knew they were in a nuclear arms race. And they say, unless we have civilians and not the military controlling atomic technology, no other power will believe us and try to enter into any kind of an agreement. So their first step was to take it out of the hands of the Army. Remember, during the war, there was a time when Groves said the scientists all ought to wear uniforms, and that was a contentious issue. Remember also that from the very beginning, the scientists really were calling the shots. And they knew much more than the Army or anybody else until the project developed. So here they were saying, we now need civilian control for the reason that it would affect our negotiation. And they successfully beat the May-Johnson bill. Well, Groves, of course, was furious about this. He thought he was going to be a conquering hero. He, the man who had made the bomb, was now going to be running the atomic program after the war. And with the defeat of the May-Johnson bill, he was out of a job. You can imagine his hatred of Szilard at that point, and it spilled out in interviews the following year. So then the next effort was to create a civilian atomic energy commission, and this was done under the aegis of Senator Brian McMahon from Connecticut, and they drew up plans. Szilard helped negotiate, along with some lawyers in the White House, to create a civilian atomic energy commission. And there were hearings held about this, and this eventually passed and became law. In the spring of 1945, a reporter for Time magazine on the same day interviewed Leo Szilard and General Groves. By this point, the idea of a civilian atomic energy commission was already in play, and Groves was furious at what had happened to what he thought was going to be a capstone of his career. On the 8th of March in 1946, the Time reporter Francis Henderson interviewed both Groves and Szilard about the debate of whether there should be civilian control. Groves, by this point, was fuming with what had happened to Army control and ultimately to his career. "Do you know his background?" Groves asked, not waiting for her reply. "Well, Szilard was born in Hungary and served in the German army, or rather the Austrian army. Anyway, after the First World War, he studied, didn't teach, didn't, so to speak, earn his way. In this country, he was at Columbia, and there, never teaching, never doing anything really, you might say, but learn. Everywhere he went, from what I hear, he was hard to work with, the kind of man that any employer would have fired as a troublemaker. In the days before the Wagner Act, which was a 1935 law granting minimal employee rights." At that thought, the general grinned. Henderson said that it was Szilard who had initiated research that led to the Manhattan Project, and Groves had to say, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I might even go so far as to say that if it hadn't been for Szilard, it would never have reached the president." Then, realizing that he had complimented Szilard, Groves added, "Only a man with his brass would have pushed through to the president. Take Wigner or Fermi. They're not Jewish. They're quiet, shy, modest, just interested in learning." Then, why was Szilard kept on the project? Henderson wondered. Well, he was already on it, transferred from Columbia out to Chicago, where he came in on it. Frankly, we would have let him go, except we didn't trust him loose. So you can see the suspicion. And then later in life, Groves became so bitter that he actually wrote letters to encyclopedias saying that the entry that they had on Szilard was too big, that he was unimportant, and that they should not be remembered in history. The chapter in my book, A Last Fight with the General, is really sad reading, because it shows how embittered Groves became about Szilard, almost obsessed. about Szilard. In fact, in 1954, when there was a security hearing on the security credentials of J. Robert Oppenheimer, Groves was a witness. And Groves was a witness in favor of Oppenheimer. And if you read the transcript, and I found a copy of Szilard's copy in which he marked it up, here in the middle of talking about this serious problem with Oppenheimer's security clearances, Groves goes off on a soliloquy about troublesome scientists and about troublemakers who he thought slowed down the project. It's in the context where publicly Szilard had said it was Groves's compartmentalization that kept them from working together and doing things sooner, but Groves thought that that was the only way it would work. So here in the middle of the very intense security hearing on Oppenheimer, Groves goes off for 2.5 pages in this transcript about troublesome scientists, in which he says they were troublemakers and we should have fired them. If this were Germany, we would have just lined them up and shot them. Groves couldn't get Szilard out of his mind. And it's the classic science-military conflict that lives to this day. Oppenheimer was charged in the security hearing, which was actually secret, in part because he had some communist associations, but principally, I think, because Lewis Strauss, who was head of the Atomic Energy Commission, wanted his friend Edward Teller to be the new Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was quite controversial when he didn't support the idea of a hydrogen bomb. And so he became a target for those who wanted to pursue the nuclear arms race with the new hydrogen weapon. Szilard heard that his good friend Edward Teller was going to be called in to testify about Oppenheimer, and he feared that Teller would testify against Oppenheimer. And so the night before the hearing that Teller testified in, he flew down from New York to Washington and tried to find Teller, to try to talk him out of testifying against Oppenheimer. Szilard didn't particularly like Oppenheimer personally, but he did respect the notion that you should restrict thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen weapons, and so he admired him professionally. Szilard and Oppenheimer had a run-in shortly after Szilard had met with James Burns. On the 28th of May in 1945, Szilard took a train back from Spartanburg, and in General Groves's own office in Washington, arranged a meeting with Oppenheimer. Now that day was one of the meeting days of the interim committee, and Oppenheimer was one of the scientists who was invited to give advice to the interim committee. And in General Groves's office, Oppenheimer and Szilard squared off, and Szilard argued about a demonstration, Szilard argued about international control. Above all, Szilard argued you shouldn't use this weapon on civilians. To which Oppenheimer said, in effect, he used some crass language, but he said, in effect, this is a useless weapon. It has no military value, it has only shock value. And he dismissed Szilard's notion that it might somehow be negotiated or controlled. And Oppenheimer, when he went into the interim committee in subsequent meetings, argued for using the bomb on cities. It was only after the month of September that Oppenheimer had second thoughts about this and came around to be known today as someone who criticized the use of the bomb. So Szilard, at that crucial point when Oppenheimer might have made a difference, if anyone could have, Szilard felt he was betrayed by Oppenheimer and that the view of the scientists was really not represented in the interim committee. He had almost no other contact with Oppenheimer, but he did agree with his views on the hydrogen bomb, and so he didn't want Teller testifying against Oppenheimer, who he thought was still still should have a voice in public policy. So he ran all over Washington, D.C. the night before Teller was going to testify, trying to find him. It turned out that the lawyers for the AEC had Teller sequestered, and he couldn't have found him anyway. So he went back to the hotel room. His wife was with him at the time, and said, "I can't find Teller. And if I can't find Teller, I'm going to have to defend Oppenheimer the rest of my life." But he did. Teller did testified against Oppenheimer, and became an outcast in the scientific community as a result. It was something that Szilard tried to prevent, in part not so much because he liked Oppenheimer, but he liked Teller. Teller was a good, dear personal friend. And in the years that followed, they disagreed bitterly over whether you could trust the Russians to control nuclear weapons, whether you could have test bans and other things. But they were always personal friends to the end. And so it was in his personal concern for Teller that he wanted him not to testify against Oppenheimer.
Do you want to talk about his dedication to arms control?
Sure. Yeah. As we've seen, even before the bomb was used, Szilard was worried about international control of atomic weapons to try to stop nuclear proliferation. As soon as the bomb was used, and he knew that the Allies were meeting in Moscow in December of 1945, he tried to arrange to have scientists from the Soviet Union and the US and Britain sit in on those meetings. He always thought that scientists, not only in this case, knew more than anybody else about these weapons, but that they had reason, and that reason would somehow inform the international scene, and that the reasonable advice of scientists would somehow control the nuclear arms race. That idea was dismissed, and afterwards, for several years, he tried various informal ways of getting Russian and American scientists to talk behind the scenes. This eventually came to pass in 1957 when he helped set up and was the first participant in the Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs, in which Russians and Americans and Britons and people from several other countries met in Pugwash, Nova Scotia, which is why it has that distinctive title, and ever since have been working for scientists to meet among themselves and then to advise their governments on chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, health hazards, anything where science feels it has a voice in the public debate. Szilard attended the first organizing meeting after the first Pugwash meeting. The meeting was in Pugwash that summer in Nova Scotia, and that December, Bertrand Russell was one of the people who had organized what led to the Pugwash conferences, and they were having a planning meeting. Szilard happened to be in London. He sat in. I get this story from Joseph Rotblat, who was a leader of Pugwash for a long time. And Bertrand Russell wanted to politicize Pugwash. He wanted to make it a public movement, like the campaign for nuclear disarmament, where people were marching, in that case to the military bases. They were marching in Trafalgar Square. He wanted it to be public. You remember the peace symbol with the line and the circle. And he wanted to politicize and publicize Pugwash. According to Joseph Rotblat at that meeting, Szilard, who was only sitting in but had attended the first Pugwash, said, "No, you can't do that. The only value of this is that it be behind the scenes and that it be off the record." And he persuaded enough of the members of who were deciding to talk Bertrand Russell out of making it public, and it remained to this day something that goes on behind the scenes. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima, Joseph Rotblat, the leader, and Pugwash received the Nobel Peace Prize.
That's good. Yeah, one thing that would be good, if you can describe how how Szilard in his efforts took over the jury hotels, lobby, and,
Oh yeah.
And kind of talk about his eccentricities about not liking to rent an apartment, but rather staying in an hotel.
Sure. I have another story first. I think we ought to. After the war, Szilard, as he had during the war, tried almost any way he could to influence controls over nuclear proliferation. In 1947, he wrote a political satire called My Trial as a War Criminal. It was published in 1949 in a University of Chicago publication. In this, there's a Third World War, and Russia wins, and they come to this country and they line up and round up all the people who had anything to do with the atomic bomb, because the US was the only country to have used the atomic bomb on civilians. So Truman and Burns and Oppenheimer and Fermi and Szilard are all rounded up. I won't spoil the story, it's worth reading, as to why they were never tried as war criminals. But it was Szilard's early effort to say that scientists have a responsibility for what they do. In 1961, a collection of Szilard's short stories, with the lead story, The Voice of the Dolphins, was published by Simon & Schuster and was a popular, well-reviewed book. And in that collection was My Trial as a War Criminal. In the Soviet Union, at the secret city where they were making nuclear and thermonuclear weapons, Viktor Adamski, a colleague of Andrei Sakharov, read that essay and thought enough to translate it and shared it with his colleague Andrei Sakharov. And according to Richard Rhodes, who interviewed Adamski for his book on the hydrogen bomb called Dark Sun, Adamski says that that story by Szilard got Sakharov thinking about his moral responsibilities and eventually drove him to the activism that led to the Nobel Peace Prize and his concern about arms control. Viktor Adamski also read Genius in the Shadows when it first came out and decided he would translate that. And he wrote a wonderful new introduction about Szilard and how Szilard was an individual who, despite all the structure, the political structure, the military structure, managed to be effective. He was almost like a free neutron himself. And he admired Szilard for being outside of power, but also still being able to mobilize power in a special way. And so there is now a Russian edition of Genius in the Shadows, which was translated by the very grateful Viktor Adamski. Szilard never lived in a house. He never learned to drive. He always lived in hotels or faculty clubs. He always kept 2 bags packed, as he had since Hitler took power, just in case. And he was always footloose. Victor Weisskopf, who knew him well in Berlin and later in the United States, said Leo Szilard was a man who had an office in Chicago, a wife in Denver, and lived in a hotel in New York. And I've found instances when he was actually living in 2 hotels at once. He was still checked into the King's Crown Hotel at Columbia, but in the early 50s he helped set up Brandeis University and was one of the first professors there. And he had a hotel in Boston the same day. He had hotel rooms in a couple of cities. So So he was always very itinerant. When I first worked on the Szilard biography, his papers had not yet been organized. And so I found that the organization was by the color of the suitcase that they had been found in. So the plaid bag from Mount Vernon contained all these documents. And then the blue bag from New York. And he had stashed all these bags with other relatives, and after his death, they all came out of the closets, and that's how we have the very rich Leo Szilard archive. Incidentally, the National Archives has given a grant to the University of California, San Diego, to digitize all of Szilard's papers. And that project is going on right now and will take close to a year. And then every document and picture in the Szilard archive will be available on the internet. Szilard never really liked living in a house. He didn't know what a house was. He visited his brother-in-law in Boston one time, and he wanted a tour. He wanted to know how the laundry was done. He wanted to know how did the furnace work? Where do they get water pressure? Where do they store their clothes? And he, in effect, got a tour of a typical American house, which was really quite strange to him. He lived beginning in 1961 in the DuPont Plaza Hotel, which is on DuPont Circle in Washington. And he was there because he was here to lobby the new Kennedy administration. He had some friends from Pugwash, including Jerome Wiesner, who was the president's science advisor. And he wanted to come and bring the sweet voice of reason to Washington. And he did this by lobbying from the lobby. He didn't want to arrange for an office, and he found his own hotel room too small. So he took over the desk in the lobby of the DuPont Plaza Hotel, which is normally reserved for visitors writing postcards, invited in a secretary, held interviews there, invited people to come and visit him. And there's a wonderful photograph in Life magazine of Szilard working away. There's a doorman in the background in the front desk of the hotel, and there's Szilard working away at his desk in the lobby of the DuPont Plaza Hotel. Szilard still kept trying after 1961 to influence policy. He was elected to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And within a week of being elected, he wanted to have a petition by members of the National Academy of Sciences condemning President Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. He sent this around. He discovered very painfully that, in fact, petitions weren't the way you should behave anymore, because he sent a copy to James Franck, who had been his colleague and his advisor, and with whom he shared many things. And Franck wrote him a very touching but powerful letter saying that it's not our right as scientists, just because we're scientists, to intervene in all sorts of policy debate, unless it's specific to our own concern. And in this case, atomic scientists had nothing to do with the invasion by mercenaries of Cuba. I think it really affected Szilard. And afterwards, he realized petitions were really not the way to influence policy. He thought instead he would buy politicians. In The Voice of the Dolphins, which is a tale about how the nuclear arms race ultimately ended in the 1980s, he wrote in the 1960s that there was a joint U.S. study center in Vienna, and that they enlisted dolphins who had the biggest cranial capacity of any mammal, and they taught them language, and taught them math, and the dolphins worked up all these wonderful solutions that won them Nobel Prizes, and then they funneled the money from the Nobel Prizes into this foundation, and they arranged to have a radio broadcast called The Voice of the Dolphins, in which worldwide they gave sound advice, he thought reasonable advice, on how the world's problems should be solved. But in The Voice of the Dolphins, there's a second way of influencing policy, and that is to take these millions of dollars that the Institute had and just bribe somebody to do the right thing. Well, Szilard didn't quite do that with Congress, but he came close in the following way. He said the only way we're going to have arms control is if we have treaties. And they were non-proliferation treaties, they were test ban treaties. Treaties are approved by the Senate. So if you can have enough sympathetic senators for arms control in the Senate, then you will pass treaties. And the treaties will, in effect, control, at least beginning to control, the nuclear arms race. So he created something called the Council to Abolish War, which was in 1962, which quickly was renamed the Council for a Livable World. And he said what they wanted to do was to bundle donations. So they would pick senators and candidates for the Senate who were sympathetic to arms control, write to their members and say, you should write a check to Senator so-and-so or Mr. so-and-so, and then the council would bundle this money and deliver it to the senator. But he said there's a certain calculus here. He said every state has 2 senators. So you don't want to go to the large population states. You go to the small population states where for much less money you're able to influence. And for something like $60,000, they influenced the campaign of George McGovern, who became their first successful candidate in the U.S. Senate. The Council for a Livable World continues. Every year they try to identify senators and now congressmen who are sympathetic to arms control and their issues, and then they tell their members to write checks to those particular people. So it was Szilard's finally his direct effect. He wasn't going to affect public opinion with a petition. He was finally going to put people who cared about these issues in places where they could apply the pressure. Szilard was living at the DuPont Plaza Hotel, trying to influence Congress through the Council for a Livable World, and trying to influence the Kennedy administration through the several scientists he knew in the White House, in and around the White House. But when Kennedy was assassinated, he really lost heart. He had no contact with the Johnson White House, and by this time he was also concerned about an entirely different effort, namely biology. As early as 1932, he met Max Delbruck, a physicist in Berlin, and they talked about biology. Delbruck, like many others, was moving from physics to biology. Szilard saw biology as the next theoretical science after physics. He was about to become a biologist by working at the University of London in September 1933 when he thought up the chain reaction, and it wasn't until 1946, after he was fired from the Manhattan Project, that he took up biology again. But he did quite successfully and eventually proposed some ideas that won other people the Nobel Prize. He was interested in I think you could say a critical mass of biologists. And for example, he became frustrated with the idea that you had to publish something, submit some paper, have it peer-reviewed, and then have it published in a journal, and then other people might see it. So he convened around the University of Chicago what they called the Molecular Biology and Science Marching and Chowder Society, something like that. And he got Salvador Luria, later a Nobel laureate, James Watson, later a Nobel laureate, several other scientists, Joshua Lederberg, and other biologists, just meet for dinner once a month and share your ideas. And that short-circuited by many months the exchange of ideas. Francois Jacob, who won a Nobel Prize with Szilard's idea, later described him as being an intellectual bumblebee. And he loved to just cross-pollinate ideas with ideas. He'd go to a party and he'd take someone aside and he'd interrogate them in the bedroom and then let them come in. Now you tell me this. And so-and-so says that. And so-and-so says that. Then he flies to another city. So-and-so says this. What are you doing? And he arrived at the Pasteur Institute in the mid-1950s, and he heard that they were looking at a particular problem of enzyme control, and whether it was a repressive or an anti-repressive trigger that set this off. In other words, something about the on-off switch of this enzyme regulation. And Szilard thought that in fact it was anti-repression and not repression that was leading to this. And Jacques Monod, who also won the Nobel Prize for this idea, said despite his persistent belief that it wasn't true, he finally tested Szilard's idea and it proved to be true. And so in their speech in 1965, the year after Szilard died, both Francois Jacob and Jacques Monod acknowledged that it was Szilard who was behind this idea. And when they first published this idea, not as an endnote, but just as a final note, was that the visit of Dr. Szilard to the Pasteur Institute led us to do what we had done, which was a major discovery in biology. So Szilard had these ideas, but again, he didn't really have a lab of his own. He didn't really stick to it. He was just glad to get these ideas out. But then he started thinking, well, with William During, who was then a chemist at Yale, and also a colleague on the Council for a Livable World later on, he thought you really should have a study institute that looks at the hard science and looks at the social implications. At the time, Jonas Salk, who had developed a successful virus control for polio, was thinking of creating a biology study center in Pittsburgh, where he had done his work in the polio virus. And Szilard said to Salk, no first-rate scientist is going to move to Pittsburgh. You should go to San Diego, California, and here's why. In the 1950s, Szilard had been a consultant at General Atomics in San Diego. The new University of California San Diego campus was being created. The Scripps Institution of Oceanography was there, and Szilard saw this as a place where biology especially would find a new center. And he said you should locate in San Diego, especially La Jolla, California. Well, it helped that the mayor of San Diego had been a polio victim as a child and was very sympathetic to this idea and donated the land. There was lots of public land available for what's now the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. Szilard was one of the first fellows of the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, and there he did some instrumental work in memory and recall, a paper that's still respected. Unfortunately, he died about 4 months after he moved to San Diego, and so the Salk Institute continued without him. But that's another one of his legacies, another institution he helped create, which to this day has become the focal point for biological and biotech research in San Diego. It's become a cluster as Silicon Valley used to be and still is with other technology. Other thoughts?
He's amazing. Just thinking about whether you want to, how you want to close this. Do you want to go to the 10 Commandments, or?
That's a good idea, yeah. I could also describe how his ashes went up in balloons. Want to do it? Want to do that?
Sure.
Let's do the 10 Commandments first. The Einstein letter to FDR is dated April 2nd, and it's the date that Szilard and Teller actually met with Einstein and agreed on the draft. On August 4th, Szilard had serious thoughts about what they were doing, so serious that they almost became cosmological. He thought that what they were doing was going to change the face of the world. With the Einstein drafts in the mail, he at last had a chance to pause, to think about what he was doing, to face the awesome and chilling consequences of his actions. This new and gravid collaboration with Einstein brought back Szilard's earlier reflections with his mentor on the fate of humanity, questions of God. Now Szilard felt compelled to make sense of this dreadful future they were about to create. What better expert to turn to than God himself? So Szilard decided to write his own 10 Commandments. For example, instead of honor thy father and thy mother, Szilard says, honor children. Listen reverently to their words and speak to them with infinite love. Instead of thou shalt not bear false witness, he says, do not lie without need. And instead of thou shalt not kill, he says, do not destroy what you cannot create. The Szilard 10 Commandments are very much more humanistic and very much more personal than the admonition that Moses had laid down on the human race. In fact, I've thought of a fun play, or at least a skit, called The Big Ten. What about when Szilard dies and goes to heaven? And at first, St. Peter doesn't want to let him in because he's a self-professed mass murderer, but finally he does, and then God calls him in, and he says, well, Dr. Szilard, you wrote your own 10 Commandments, and he calls in Moses, and then the play or the skit goes on with God and Moses and Szilard deciding which 10 Commandments are the best. But this was something that he did that survives to this day, I think, as a personal touch of Szilard's own notion of man's place in the world. Szilard was very happy as one of the first fellows at the Salk Institute. He especially liked brainstorming with Jacob Bronowski and with Francis Crick, and he was having the time of his life. Unfortunately, on the morning of May 30th, 1964, he died in his sleep of a massive heart attack. At the memorial service at the Salk Institute, Jonas Salk talked about how Szilard's work in peace and in science were all of one piece to make this a better world. In 1960, Szilard had contracted bladder cancer and worked out his own radiation method, which in fact had cured him of bladder cancer. And so Ed Lennox, who was a biologist at the Salk Institute, reflected on how if Szilard was able to cure himself of bladder cancer, why he couldn't also prevent a heart attack. And he concluded God never would have got Leo if he had been awake. Szilard left instructions that rather than bury his ashes, they should be put in brightly colored balloons and released so at least it would delight all the children. That never happened until many years later. In 1998, on the 100th anniversary of Szilard's death, Szilard's ashes were divided, and half of them went to the Kerepesi Cemetery in Hungary, and the other half went to the Lakeview Cemetery in Ithaca, New York, where his wife's family was buried. And at that time, some great nieces and great nephews put some of Szilard's ashes into an airmail envelope, wrote on it, "He did his best," which is what Szilard wanted as his epitaph, and with brightly colored balloons released Szilard's ashes off in the direction of the Atlantic Ocean. The title of the book that I wrote about Szilard is called Genius in the Shadows, because in part he's not as well known as other people. This happened for several reasons. First of all, he was bright and thought if you just thought up bright ideas and gave them to people in power, that would be enough. Second, he changed fields. Most people who become famous in science are famous for being a biologist or a chemist or an astrophysicist. Well, Szilard was a physicist in which he worked first on information theory and then put that aside. And then he worked on atomic energy. And then later he worked on biology. Again, sharing ideas, in fact, giving ideas away. And so there was no real public record or awareness of how Szilard was going to be remembered. There was a scientist, Andrei Sakharov, who publicly protested the use of nuclear weapons. There was a scientist, the chemist Linus Pauling, who became a celebrity for the demonstrations that he arranged. Some scientists have been famous for the kind of work they did, but Szilard missed out on that kind of limelight. I think also General Groves had a hand in this, in that he tried to diminish Szilard's role afterwards in terms of how Szilard would be remembered. But I think also the fact was that Szilard was always so far ahead of his time that everything he was thinking about was only recognized years later as being traceable to him. For example, I did an article for the Atlantic Monthly about the nuclear breeder reactor. And I said in this article, I was researching, where did the chain reaction come from? Leo Szilard. Where did the breeder reaction come from? Leo Szilard. First breeder was built, it's named for Enrico Fermi. I said, where is this guy Szilard? And when I started this article, I wrote him into the article and then discovered his brother and then wrote this biography. But there was no biography of Leo Szilard. Somehow he had really slipped through the cracks. And in part, I think it's because he did so many things so well, but did them so modestly, or so secretly, if you will, that he was never really remembered. He also had a name that's very hard to spell and pronounce. But more importantly, I think he was somebody who always lived in the realm of ideas. And to the extent that those ideas have touched us, I think we should all be grateful.